Welcome back to Emma's Stories, where we've been lighting up your nights with tales of passion and romance that make your heart skip a beat. But tonight, we're stirring things up, trading those starry-eyed love stories for something richer, something that digs a little deeper. Get ready for a journey into the kind of love that builds families, the unbreakable bonds that warm your soul and remind you what truly lasts. These are the stories that stick with you, the ones that make you laugh, cry, and hold your loved ones a little closer, and we can't wait to share this new flavor with you. Tonight, we're stepping into the life of James Carter, a man who thought success was everything until one winter evening flipped his world upside down. James is 35, a New York entrepreneur who rules Wall Street with a sharp mind and a guarded heart. He's built his life on control, ambition, and long days that leave no room for anything else. But on this cold December night, he's about to find out that family can find you, even when you're not looking. It's late and the city is dusted with snow. James is tired, worn out from meetings and deadlines, so he skips the usual upscale spots and heads to Maple Diner, a small place on the edge of New York. The moment he walks in, the smell of warm waffles and the glow of soft lights hit him. It's simple, cozy with wooden tables and the hum of quiet conversations, a far cry from his high-stakes world. He slides into a corner booth, orders a black coffee, and lets the tension in his shoulders ease just a little. He's not here for peace, though. He's here because of an email he got earlier. "I have something you need to know. Meet me at Maple Diner, 7 o'clock tonight." No name, no details, just a pull he can't ignore. He figures it's business, something to handle quickly and move on. As he waits, he reaches for his phone but feels something else in his coat pocket, an old envelope he doesn't recall grabbing. He pulls it out, sees his name in faded ink and the sender, Grace Miller. The name tugs at him, a woman he loved 6 years ago, before he chose his career over her. The letter's unopened, postmarked back then, and he wonders why it surfaced now. He doesn't open it, just stuffs it back, brushing it off as a ghost from the past. But the clock ticks closer to 7, and the diner feels alive, like it's waiting for something big. James doesn't know it yet, but a little girl named Sophie is about to walk in and unravel everything. She's 6 years old, with eyes just like his, and she's carrying a secret tied to that letter. This isn't just a meeting, it's fate knocking on his door, ready to show him what he's been missing. Stick around, because this story of family, love, and second chances is about to begin, and it's one that'll stay with you long after it ends. James Carter sits in the corner booth at Maple Diner, his coffee cooling as he checks his watch. It's almost 7 o'clock and the mysterious email weighs on his mind. He expects a client, maybe a deal to close, something to fit neatly into his structured life. The diner buzzes around him, families chatting over plates of food, the clink of dishes blending with laughter. He barely notices, his focus on the door, waiting for whoever sent that message. Outside, snow falls thicker now, painting the windows in white, and he wonders if they'll even show up in this weather. But then the door swings open, and everything changes. A small figure steps inside, a girl no more than 6 years old, bundled in a red coat that's too big for her tiny frame. She's dragging a little backpack, her dark curls peeking out from under a knit hat. James watches as she scans the room, her big blue eyes bright and determined. She doesn't look lost, not like a kid wandering in by mistake. She looks like she's on a mission. To his surprise, she marches straight toward him, her boots leaving wet prints on the floor. She stops at his table, climbs onto the seat across from him, and fixes him with a serious stare. "Hi," she says, her voice clear and steady. "I'm the one you're supposed to meet." James blinks, caught off guard. He leans forward, half smiling, thinking this must be a mix-up. "Hey, kiddo," he says gently. "I think you've got the wrong guy. Who sent you here?" The girl tilts her head, studying him like she's sizing him up. Then she unzips her backpack, pulls out an old photograph, and slides it across the table. James picks it up, and his breath catches. It's him, 6 years ago, standing in a park with his arm around a woman, Grace Miller. They're smiling, happy, a moment from a life he walked away from. His hands tremble as he looks back at the girl. Those blue eyes, They're his eyes, staring right back at him. "Where did you get this?" he asks, his voice barely above a whisper. She points at the photo. "Mommy said you're the man in the picture. She said your name is James. I wanted to meet you." Her words hit him like a punch, simple and honest, and his mind races. Before he can respond, the diner door flies open again and Grace rushes in, her face pale with worry. "Sophie," she calls, her voice sharp with panic. She spots her daughter, hurries over, and freezes when she sees James holding the photo. The air between them thickens, heavy with years of silence. "Grace," James says, standing up, his tone a mix of shock and something deeper, something he can't name yet. Grace kneels beside Sophie, pulling her close. "What are you doing here? I told you to stay with Aunt Lisa." Sophie squirms, looking up at her mom. "I heard you talking last night when you were sick. You said James over and over like you missed him. I found the picture in your box and I came to find him." Grace's eyes widen, her hand covering her mouth. She looks at James, guilt and fear swirling in her expression. "She wasn't supposed to be here," Grace says softly. "She took the bus herself. I didn't know until Lisa called me." James stares at them, the pieces clicking together too fast, too loud. Sophie, 6 years old, with his eyes, his stubborn streak. Grace, the woman he loved, standing here with a daughter who knows his name. "Grace," he says again, his voice rough now. "Who is she to me?" Grace swallows hard, tears brimming in her dark eyes. She doesn't answer right away, but Sophie does. "Mommy says you're my daddy," she announces, like it's the most natural thing in the world. "She talks about you when she thinks I'm asleep." The diner fades around James, the noise dropping away until it's just the three of them. He looks at Grace, waiting for her to deny it, to explain it away, but she doesn't. She just nods, a single tear slipping down her cheek. "It's true," she whispers. "She's yours, James. Sophie's your daughter." His knees feel weak and he grips the edge of the table to steady himself. 6 years. 6 years of not knowing, of living a life that suddenly feels empty compared to the little girl sitting across from him. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asks, his voice breaking. Grace looks down at Sophie, brushing a curl from her face. "I tried," she says, "but I didn't think you'd want this. I didn't think you'd want us." Sophie reaches out, tugging at James's sleeve with her small hand. "Are you mad?" she asks, her eyes wide and searching. James looks at her, really looks at her, and something inside him cracks open. "No," he says, his throat tight. "I'm not mad at you, Sophie." He doesn't know what to feel, not yet, but he knows one thing. This little girl, with his eyes and her mother's courage, has just walked into his life and turned it upside down. And as Grace watches him, her own heart breaking, James realizes this is only the beginning of a truth he's not ready for, a truth that started with a letter he never opened. James Carter stands frozen in Maple Diner, his hand still gripping the edge of the table as Grace's words echo in his ears. "She's yours, James. Sophie's your daughter." The little girl, Sophie, sits across from him, her blue eyes watching him with a mix of curiosity and hope. Grace kneels beside her, her face a tangle of guilt and fear, waiting for him to say something, anything. The diner hums around them, but to James, it's just noise. His mind is spinning, trying to make sense of 6 years lost, 6 years he didn't know he had a child. He looks at Sophie again, her small hand resting on that old photo of him and Grace, and his chest tightens. "Why didn't you tell me?" he repeats, his voice low, raw with a hurt he can't hide. Grace stands slowly, brushing her hands on her jeans like she's steadying herself. "I tried," she says, her voice trembling. "I tried to tell you, James, but you were gone. You were building your empire, chasing something I couldn't compete with. I didn't think you'd want this life, a kid, me." Her words sting, sharp and heavy, and James shakes his head, disbelief washing over him. "You didn't think I'd want my own daughter?" he asks, louder now, drawing a few glances from nearby tables. Sophie shrinks back a little, and Grace steps closer to her, protective. "I was scared," Grace admits, softer this time. I was scared you'd say no, that you'd walk away from us like you walked away from me. James opens his mouth to argue, to tell her she's wrong, but then he remembers the envelope in his pocket, the one he found earlier, unopened for 6 years. His hand moves almost on its own, pulling it out again. The faded ink stares back at him, Grace Miller, a name he buried under years of work and ambition. "What's that?" Sophie asks, leaning forward, her voice cutting through the tension. James doesn't answer her. He looks at Grace instead, holding up the letter. "Is this what I think it is?" he asks, his tone sharp. Grace's eyes widen, recognition flashing across her face. "You kept it?" she whispers, like she can't believe it. "I sent that right after we broke up. I didn't think you'd ever see it." His fingers tremble as he tears the envelope open, the paper crinkling in the quiet between them. He unfolds the single page inside, and the words hit him like a wave. "James," he reads aloud, his voice unsteady. "I don't know how to say this, so I'll just write it. I'm pregnant. It's yours. If you're reading this, please find me. I don't want to do this alone, but I will if I have to. Grace." He stops, the letter shaking in his hands, and looks up at her. "You wrote this 6 years ago," he says, almost to himself. "You told me then, and I didn't even know." Grace nods, tears spilling down her cheeks now. "I mailed it to your old apartment. I thought you got it and chose not to answer. When I didn't hear back, I figured that was your answer." James sinks back into the booth, the letter falling onto the table. "I didn't get it," he says, his voice breaking. "I moved offices, changed addresses. I was so caught up in work I didn't even check my mail half the time. It must have gotten lost, forwarded somewhere, I don't know. I found it today, Grace, just today, in a box of old stuff." He runs a hand through his hair, his mind reeling. "If I'd seen this, if I'd known, I would have come for you." His eyes land on Sophie, who's watching him with wide eyes, her little hands clutching the photo like it's a lifeline. "You would have?" Grace asks, her voice small, like she's afraid to hope. He nods, swallowing hard. "Yeah, I would have. I don't know what kind of father I'd have been back then, but I would have tried. I wouldn't have let you do it alone." The words feel heavy, true, and they hang in the air between them. Sophie scoots closer to the table, her voice soft but clear. "You're not mad at Mommy, right?" she asks, looking up at him. James meets her gaze, those blue eyes that mirror his own, and something inside him softens. "No," he says, forcing a small smile. "I'm not mad at your mom. I'm just sorry, Sophie. Sorry I wasn't there." Grace wipes her eyes, trying to pull herself together. "I didn't want to trap you," she says. "You were on your way up, meetings, deals, traveling the world. I didn't think a baby fit into that. So I stayed quiet after that letter. I moved here, got a job, raised her. I told myself it was better this way." James shakes his head again, frustration mixing with regret. "You decided for me," he says, not accusing, just stating it. "You didn't give me a chance to choose." Grace flinches, but she doesn't argue. "I know," she whispers. "I know that now." Sophie reaches across the table, her small hand brushing the letter. "Did Mommy write that to you?" she asks, curious. James nods, his throat tight. "Yeah, she did. A long time ago, when you were just a tiny idea." Sophie tilts her head, thinking. "So you didn't know about me?" she asks. "Not until tonight," he says, his voice cracking. She frowns, then brightens a little. "That's okay," she says, like she's forgiving him. I didn't know about you either, but I found you now." Her words hit James hard, a mix of innocence and truth that cuts through the mess of his emotions. He looks at the letter again, then at Grace, who's watching him with a fragile hope he hasn't seen in her before. 6 years, he says quietly. "I missed 6 years." Grace nods, her lip trembling. "I'm sorry, James. I thought I was protecting you, protecting her. I was wrong." He doesn't respond right away, just looks at Sophie, who's smiling at him like he's already someone she trusts. And in that moment, he knows there's more to this story, more Grace isn't saying, but the letter has already changed everything. It's the first crack in the wall he's built around himself, and Sophie's the one holding the hammer. James Carter sits across from Sophie in the Maple Diner booth, the crumpled letter still lying on the table between them. Its words burn in his mind, a plea from Grace 6 years ago that he never heard until tonight. Sophie's small hand rests near it, her blue eyes flicking between him and her mother, like she's trying to figure out this new piece of her world. Grace stands beside the table, her arms crossed tight, her face pale under the diner's warm lights. The air feels thick, heavy, with the weight of what's just been said. Sophie is his daughter, a truth James is still grappling with. He looks at Grace, his voice low but steady. "You should have tried harder," he says. "A letter I didn't get, that's one thing, but 6 years, Grace. Why didn't you call? Come find me." Grace shifts, her eyes dropping to the floor. "I wanted to," she says, her voice barely above a whisper. "After the letter, I thought about it all the time. Picking up the phone, showing up at your office. But every time I got close, I stopped myself." She glances at Sophie, who's watching them quietly. "I kept seeing you on the news, James, in suits, shaking hands with big names. You were building something huge, and I was just a single mom with a kid and a waitressing job. I didn't want to be the one who dragged you down." James leans forward, his jaw tight. "That wasn't your call to make," he says. "She's my daughter, too. I had a right to know." Grace nods, tears welling up again. "I know," she says. "I know that now. But back then I was scared. Not just of you saying no, but of everything." Her voice cracks and she presses a hand to her chest, like it hurts to breathe. James narrows his eyes, catching the gesture. "Everything?" he asks, sensing there's more she's holding back. Grace hesitates, her lips parting, then closing again. Sophie tugs at her sleeve, her voice, "Mommy, are you okay?" Grace forces a smile, brushing Sophie's hair back. "I'm fine, baby," she says, but James sees the strain in her eyes, the way her hand shakes, just a little. "Grace," he says, sharper now, "what aren't you telling me?" She looks at him, and for a moment it's like she's deciding whether to let him in. Then she sighs, a sound so weary it makes his stomach twist. "It's not just about you," she says finally. "It's about me, too." She sits down across from him, next to Sophie, her hands folding together on the table. "A few years ago, I started getting tired, really tired. I thought it was just stress, raising Sophie alone, working late shifts. But then I passed out one day right here in the diner. They took me to the hospital, ran tests." She pauses, swallowing hard. "It's my heart, James. Something I was born with, a defect they didn't catch until it got worse. They say it's manageable, but lately it's not." James stares at her, the words sinking in slow and heavy. "You're sick?" he asks, his voice rough. Grace nods, looking down at her hands. "Yeah, I get dizzy spells. Sometimes I can't breathe right. Last night I had a bad one, passed out on the couch. That's when Sophie heard me talking about you. I didn't even know I was saying your name until she told me today." Sophie pipes up, her voice soft but clear. "You kept saying James, Mommy, like you were calling him? I thought maybe he could help you." Grace's eyes fill with tears, and she pulls Sophie close, kissing the top of her head. "Oh, sweetie," she murmurs, "you shouldn't have to worry about that." James feels like the ground's shifting under him. "How bad is it?" he asks, dreading the answer. Grace shrugs, a small, helpless gesture. "They don't know. Could be years, could be less. I've been managing with meds, but it's getting harder. That's why Sophie's been staying with my sister sometimes, why she was supposed to be there tonight instead of here." She looks at him, her eyes pleading. "I didn't tell you about her because I didn't want you to feel trapped, James. And then, when I got sick, I didn't want you to come back just because you felt sorry for me. I wanted it to be real, if it ever happened." The second twist lands like a blow, and James's hands curl into fists on the table. "Real?" he says, his voice rising. "You think this isn't real? You're telling me my daughter's been out there, and you're sick? And I've been living my life like none of it matters?" He stops, catching himself, and lowers his voice when he sees Sophie flinch. Grace, I didn't know. You kept all of this from me, the letter, Sophie, your heart. What else are you hiding? Grace shakes her head, tears spilling over now. Nothing, she says. That's it, I swear. I've been holding on to this for so long, trying to protect her, protect you. But when Sophie found that picture and came here, I knew it was over. I couldn't keep it anymore. Sophie reaches out, her small hand touching James's arm. Mommy's been really tired, she says, her voice trembling. She says she's okay, but I don't think she is. Can you fix it? Her words break something in James, a wall he didn't even know he'd built. He looks at her, this little girl who's asking him to save her mom, and he feels helpless in a way he's never felt before. I don't know, Sophie, he says, honest and raw. But I'm going to try. He turns to Grace, his eyes burning with a mix of anger and determination. You should have told me all of it. Not just for me, for her. She deserves both of us. Grace nods, wiping her face with her sleeve. I know, she says again. I was wrong, James. I thought I was giving you freedom, but I took hers away too. She's been asking about you, wondering why other kids have dads, and she doesn't. I didn't know how to tell her the truth. Sophie climbs into Grace's lap, wrapping her arms around her neck. I don't care, she says, her voice muffled. I've found him now. That's what matters. James watches them, mother and daughter clinging to each other, and his heart aches with a love he didn't know he could feel. He reaches for the letter again, tracing the words Grace wrote 6 years ago. You said find me, he says quietly. I'm here now, Grace. And I'm not walking away, not from her, not from this. He looks at Sophie, then back at Grace, his voice steady despite the storm inside him. You've been carrying this alone long enough. Whatever's coming, we face it together. Grace's breath catches and she nods, a sob escaping her. Okay, she whispers. Okay. Sophie looks up at James, a tiny smile breaking through her worry. You're staying? She asks. He nods, reaching across to take her hand. Yeah, kiddo. I'm staying. And in that moment, with the diner lights glowing soft around them, James knows there's no going back, only forward, into a family he never knew he needed. James Carter sits in the Maple Diner booth, his hand still holding Sophie's small one, her fingers warm against his. The letter and Grace's confession about her illness linger in the air, but for now, the storm of revelations pauses. Grace sits beside Sophie, her eyes red but calmer, a fragile peace settling over her after years of carrying her secrets alone. The diner's soft glow wraps around them, a little island of light in the snowy night outside. James looks at Sophie, his daughter, and feels a pull he can't explain, a need to make up for the time he's lost. Sophie, he says, his voice gentle. How about we hang out tomorrow, just you and me, what do you think? Sophie's face lights up, her blue eyes shining. Really? She asks, bouncing a little in her seat. Can we go to the park? James nods, a smile tugging at his lips. Yeah, the park sounds perfect. Grace watches them, her expression softening. She loves Central Park, she says quietly, especially the swings. James glances at her, catching the hint of relief in her voice. Then swings it is, he says, and Sophie claps her hands, her excitement cutting through the heaviness of the moment. Grace reaches for her coat, pulling it around Sophie. We should get home, she says. It's late, and she's had a big night. James stands too, hesitant. I'll call you tomorrow, he says. Grace nods, and as they leave, Sophie turns back, waving at him with a grin. Bye, Daddy, she calls, and the word hits James like a warm wave, leaving him rooted to the spot long after the door closes behind them. The next morning, James meets them at Central Park, the air crisp and the ground dusted with snow. Sophie runs toward him, her red coat bright against the white, a book clutched in her arms. I brought this, she says, holding up a worn copy of a knight and dragon story. Mommy says you can read it to me. James takes it, his throat tightening at the trust in her voice. I'd love to, he says, and they head to the swings. Sophie climbs on, kicking her legs as James pushes her gently, the creak of the chains mixing with her laughter. After a few swings, she pats the seat next to her. "Sit with me," she says, and he does, feeling awkward but willing. He opens the book, reading about brave knights and fierce dragons, his deep voice steady as Sophie leans closer, her head resting against his arm. "Knights are strong, right?" she asks when he pauses. "Like you?" James chuckles, surprised. "I don't know about that," he says, "but I'd fight a dragon for you." Sophie grins, satisfied, and he keeps reading, losing himself in the story and her quiet giggles. Grace watches from a nearby bench, her scarf pulled tight against the cold. She doesn't interrupt, just lets them have this, and James feels her gaze, a silent permission to step into this role he's only beginning to understand. When the story ends, Sophie hops off the swing and grabs his hand. "Let's build a snowman," she says, and soon they're rolling snow into lopsided balls, Sophie directing him with the seriousness of a general. Days turn into weeks, and James becomes a steady presence. He picks Sophie up after school, takes her for hot chocolate, listens to her chatter about her friends and her favorite stuffed bear. One evening, he visits their small apartment in Brooklyn, a cozy place with bookshelves and faded rugs. Sophie insists he stay for dinner, and Grace agrees, pulling out ingredients for waffles, Sophie's favorite. James helps, stirring batter while Sophie sprinkles chocolate chips, her laughter filling the kitchen. "You're good at this," Grace says, watching him with a small smile. "Better than I expected." James shrugs, grinning. "I've got a good teacher," he says, nodding at Sophie, who beams. They sit around the table, eating warm waffles, and for the first time, James feels like he belongs somewhere that isn't an office. One night, Sophie drags out a box of crayons and paper after dinner. "Let's draw," she says, and James sits with her on the floor, sketching clumsy castles while she works on something secret. When she's done, she holds up her picture. 3 stick figures holding hands under a big yellow sun. "This is me," she says, pointing. "And Mommy, and you." James stares at it, his chest tightening. "Me?" he asks. Sophie nods. "You're my daddy now," she says simply, and the words settle into him, heavy and sweet. He pulls her into a hug, her small arms wrapping around his neck, and he feels tears prick his eyes. "Yeah," he whispers, "I am." Grace watches from the couch, her own eyes glistening, and James knows she sees it too. This family they're building, piece by piece, but it's not all easy. Grace tires quickly, her breaths shallow some days, and James notices the pills she keeps by the sink, the way she leans on the counter when she thinks no one's looking. One evening, as Sophie naps on the couch, James sits with Grace in the kitchen. "How are you holding up?" he asks, his voice low. She sighs, tracing the edge of her mug. "Some days are better than others," she says. "The doctors say it's stable, but I don't know how long that'll last." James reaches for her hand, his grip firm. "You're not alone anymore," he says. "I'm here for her, for you, whatever you need, Grace." Her fingers tighten around his and she nods, a tear slipping free. "I didn't think you'd stay," she admits. "But you did." He squeezes her hand, a promise in the gesture. "I missed too much already," he says. "I'm not missing anymore." Grace smiles, faint but real, and James feels a spark of hope, fragile but growing. They sit in silence, the hum of the apartment around them, Sophie's soft snores drifting from the couch. It's not perfect, not fixed, but it's theirs. A family stitched together by a little girl's courage and a letter that took 6 years to find its way home. James looks at Grace, then at Sophie, and knows he'd do anything to keep this, to give them the time they deserve. It's a start, and for now, that's enough to hold on to. James Carter sits on the worn couch in Grace's Brooklyn apartment, the room quiet except for the faint sound of Sophie's breathing. She's curled up beside him, her head resting on his arm, the crayon drawing of their family still clutched in her small hand. The yellow sun she drew glows bright on the page, a little piece of hope sketched by a 6-year-old who's changed everything. Grace moves softly in the kitchen, rinsing dishes from their waffle dinner, her silhouette framed by the dim light. It's a simple scene, nothing grand, but to James it's more than he ever thought he'd have. Months ago, he was a man chasing deals and deadlines, his life a blur of boardrooms and balance sheets. Now, he's here, surrounded by a family he didn't know he needed until they found him. He looks down at Sophie, her dark curls spilling over the cushion, and feels a swell of love so deep it almost hurts. She's his daughter, a truth that's settled into his bones over these weeks of swings and stories and quiet nights like this. He thinks about the letter, the one Grace wrote 6 years ago, lost in a pile of forgotten mail until fate brought it back to him. It led him here, to this moment, and he's grateful for it, even with all the years he missed. He shifts slightly, careful not to wake Sophie, and his eyes drift to Grace. She's leaning against the counter now, her hands still, her breathing a little uneven. He knows she's tired, knows the weight of her illness presses on her more each day, but she hides it well. For Sophie, for him. Grace catches him watching and walks over, sitting on the edge of the couch. "She's out cold," she says, her voice soft, a faint smile tugging at her lips. James nods, brushing a strand of hair from Sophie's face. "She's a fighter," he says, "like her mom." Grace's smile fades a little and she looks down at her hands. "I don't feel like a fighter lately," she admits. "Some days, I'm just holding on." James reaches for her hand, his fingers closing around hers. "You've been holding on for her," he says, "and now I'm here to hold on with you." Her eyes meet his, glistening with unshed tears, and she squeezes his hand back. "Thank you, James," she whispers, "for coming, for staying. I didn't think you would, not after everything." He shakes his head, his voice firm. "I was lost without this, Grace. I didn't know it until Sophie walked into that diner, until you told me the truth. I spent years building something I thought mattered, but this, you two, this is what's real." Grace's breath catches, and a tear slips free, rolling down her cheek. "I was so scared to let you in," she says. "Scared you'd leave again, or stay out of pity. But you're here because you want to be, aren't you?" James nods, his thumb brushing over her knuckles. "Yeah," he says, "I want to be here. For her, for you, for us." She leans forward, resting her forehead against his, and they sit like that, breathing together, a silent promise in the space between them. James knows it's not a fairy tale ending. Grace's heart won't heal overnight, and there are days ahead that will test them all. But as he holds her hand and feels Sophie's warmth beside him, he finds a peace he never knew he was searching for. He's not chasing anymore, not running after the next big win. He's exactly where he's meant to be, with a daughter who calls him daddy and a woman who's given him a second chance at love, not just for her, but for the family they're becoming. Grace pulls back, her smile weak but real. "Good night, James," she says, standing to head to her room. "Good night," he replies, watching her go, knowing he'll be back tomorrow and every day after. That's it for tonight, friends. James, Sophie, and Grace remind us that love doesn't always come when we expect it. Sometimes it waits, hidden in a letter, a photograph, a little girl's courage, until we're ready to see it. It's not about the time we lose, but the moments we choose to hold on to. Family can find you in the quiet of a diner, in the snow of a winter night, and when it does, it's worth everything. Thanks for joining us on Emma's Stories. Sleep tight, and we'll see you next time with another tale to warm your heart.